The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot on June 28, 1914. By August, 20 million people were scheduled to die. That's fast. Too fast. You don't mobilize 5 empires, print billions in war bonds, and convince peasants to charge into machine gun fire in 6 weeks just because one aristocrat caught a bullet in Sarajevo. Assassinations happened all the time. Kings shrugged them off over breakfast. So why did this one detonate the entire continent? Here's what they don't tell you in history class. World War I didn't start because of nationalism or alliances or imperial ego. It started because of a loan. Actually, dozens of loans, billions of marks, francs, and pounds that Europe's great powers owed each other, and a sudden, terrifying realization that it was cheaper to invade your creditor than to pay him back. You think modern countries go to war over oil? That's adorable. In 1914, they went to war over interest payments. Picture Europe at the turn of the century, not the romantic, Belle Epoque Europe of art school textbooks. The real one. A continent carved up like a birthday cake between 5 families who all hated each other but kept showing up to the same parties. The British Empire held a quarter of the globe. France still dreamed of Napoleon. Germany was the new kid with too much confidence and a factory complex that made Birmingham look like a village market. Russia was a frozen powder keg of starving peasants held together by debt and prayer. Austria-Hungary was already dead. It just hadn't stopped moving yet. And they were all broke. Not struggling broke. Catastrophically, mathematically broke. Because here's what they don't teach you about the Victorian era's endless prosperity. It was purchased on credit. Empires are expensive. Colonies are expensive. Battleships are very expensive. So European governments did what every ambitious entity does when reality exceeds their budget. They borrowed from each other, from their own citizens, from anyone holding gold. By 1914, the web of sovereign debt connecting Europe's capitals wasn't a financial system. It was a noose. Every nation owed every other nation. The numbers had become so large they stopped meaning anything. France owed Germany. Germany owed Britain. Britain owed everyone. Russia had borrowed so much from France that French bankers joked they owned the Tsar's beard. But here's the thing about sovereign debt that makes it different from your credit card. Countries don't go bankrupt. They go to war. Let me introduce you to the men who built this trap. Not one villain. That would be too simple. Start with Sergei Witte, Russia's finance minister. Brilliant man, a psychopath with a ledger. In the 1890s, he borrowed 5 billion francs from French banks to build the Trans-Siberian Railway. The French loved it. Russia was going to be the next America, they said. Unlimited wheat, unlimited timber, unlimited returns. Witte took the money, built thousands of miles of track, and fueled an industrial bubble that eventually made French investors very nervous. When they asked for their money back, he borrowed more. From Germany this time. Then there's Théophile Delcasse, France's foreign minister. He looked at Russia's debt to France and saw something beautiful. Leverage. Russia couldn't default without collapsing its economy. So France wrote a new deal. You owe us 5 billion? Fine. Here's the interest payment, if you promise to aim your army at Germany when we ask. Russia signed. They had no choice. The contract was written in gold they didn't have. Germany saw this and panicked. Deutsche Bank and its directors looked at their maps and did the math. France and Russia were forming a creditors' alliance. If war came, Germany would be fighting enemies who owned each other's economies. So they did the only logical thing. They lent massive sums to Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Not to build railways, to build loyalty. The money created a daisy chain of obligation that guaranteed if one country's loans went bad, everyone's loans went bad. By 1910, the Bank of England's ledgers showed something terrifying. Britain's financial system was so entangled that a default by any major European power would trigger a cascade that would make 2008 look like a rounding error. Here's how the trap worked. Follow the money. Imagine a giant scale. On one side, gold bars. On the other side, paper promises called sovereign bonds. In 1870, these two sides balanced perfectly, but gold is heavy. Gold doesn't grow, and empires wanted to grow very, very fast. So they started cheating the scale. France issued bonds worth 200 francs but only kept a fraction in gold. Don't worry, they told investors, the rest is backed by Russia's future wheat. Russia, of course, had already promised that wheat to Germany. Germany had already spent the money they'd theoretically receive from Russia on battleships to intimidate Britain. Britain was financing those very battleships by selling bonds to French investors. By 1914, the mountain of paper IOUs, credit notes, and re-hypothecated debt had grown so massive it completely buried the actual gold reserves. The pile was so tall that nobody could see the gold anymore. They just had to trust it was still there. Now add interest. Those bonds grew. Every year, the pile of paper got heavier. France owed Russia 200 million francs in 1900. By 1914, with compound interest, that had become 340 million. Russia couldn't pay, so they borrowed more from France to pay France back. The whole system ran on one assumption, that growth would continue forever and nobody would ever ask to see the actual gold. Then someone pulled a trigger in Sarajevo. The debt bonanza actually worked. For a while. The borrowed billions built factories that turned peasant nations into industrial powers in a single generation. Berlin in 1910 was a glass and steel monument to what credit could build. And the wealth? Obscene. French rentiers, people who lived entirely off bond interest, became so common that entire neighborhoods in Paris were built just for them. They didn't work. They just collected checks and complained that the working class had gotten too uppity. Russia was the best example. By 1914, foreign investors had poured 11 billion rubles into Russian bonds. It went into the Tsar's palaces and the pockets of aristocrats throwing parties where champagne fountains ran all night. The Russian finance ministry published pamphlets assuring investors that growth was 8% annually. The bonds were as safe as gold. None of it was true. Russia was borrowing from France to pay interest to France. It's the same mechanism your friend uses when he pays off his Visa with his MasterCard and calls it financial planning. But here's what made it a mania. Everyone knew. The bankers in Paris knew Russia was a house of cards. The traders in London knew everyone was lying about their gold reserves. But as long as the music kept playing, you'd be an idiot not to dance. June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand dies. The bond market shrugs. July 23rd, Austria issues an ultimatum to Serbia. Still, the markets hold. July 28th, Austria invades Serbia. And here's where the math starts screaming. Russia mobilizes, not for love of Serbia, but because if Austria wins, Germany becomes stronger, and the loans Germany owes Russia might never be paid. The French finance ministry cables St. Petersburg, "If you back down, we will call your loans." Russia can't afford that, so they mobilize. Germany looks at Russia and realizes, if Austria falls, German bonds become worthless. Deutsche Bank collapses. The German economy evaporates. So Germany mobilizes. Britain realizes, if France defaults, London's entire credit structure collapses. So Britain mobilizes. The assassination was the spark. The fuel was 30 years of loans. By August 1914, every major power reached the same conclusion. War was cheaper than peace. Because if you conquer your creditor, you don't have to pay them back. The debt dies with them. By July 31, 1914, the world's stock markets had already frozen and closed their doors. The entire European financial system had just admitted it was a lie. The bonds weren't backed by gold. They were backed by the assumption that nobody would ever fight. The scale had tipped. The paper was burning. 20 million people were about to pay the bill. Now let's talk about 2008, or student loans, or sovereign debt in 2026. Because if you think we learned anything, you're adorable. In 2008, American banks built a tower of paper on a foundation of home values that only go up. When housing prices stopped rising, the tower fell. Governments printed trillions to restart the music. The mechanism is identical. The asset changes. The con doesn't. Look at today. The U.S. national debt is nearly $40 trillion. Japan's debt is 260% of GDP. Europe is barely holding together under the weight of bonds that everyone knows are worthless, but nobody can admit it because the entire global banking system is built on pretending they're fine. Same mechanism, same scale, same teetering pile of paper promises. We just haven't had our Sarajevo moment yet. In 1914, they had an excuse. Central banking was experimental. We don't have that excuse. We watched it explode in 1914, 1929, and 2008, and we rebuilt the exact same machine. We just gave it new names: quantitative easing, liquidity injections, print paper, call it money, pile it on the scale. The only difference is now we don't even pretend there's gold underneath. Franz Ferdinand's assassination didn't kill 20 million people. A loan structure designed by men in expensive suits who thought they were geniuses killed 20 million people. The Archduke was just the bill coming due. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Borrow, leverage, deny, panic, collapse, repeat. We are not smarter than the bankers of 1914. We're just further along in the cycle. The next Sarajevo won't be an assassination. It might be a default, a hack, a bank run that spreads too fast to contain. But it's coming, because the machine hasn't changed. We've just gotten very good at pretending the scale is balanced. Subscribe to Papermint. We don't predict the future. We just remember the past well enough to recognize it when it shows up wearing a new suit. The paper keeps piling up. Gravity remains undefeated. See you in the next crash.